My name is Isabella Steinhauer, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. I am a senior here at CU and will be graduating in a few short weeks with a degree in International Affairs and Chinese. Thank you. Thank you. I just recently finished writing my undergraduate honors thesis on the Uyghur population in northwestern China and why some social movements are able to obtain international social support while others are not, using comparative analysis with the Tibetan movement. All right, and to get started, I would like to remind everybody that we will be using the CWA app and note card system. And does everybody know how to use that? Otherwise, if you just need a note card, our producer is right over there, and you can just signal, throw your hand up, and he will help you out with that. All right. Now that that's all squared away, I will start to introduce our panelists. Starting at the very end, we have Shadia Maharaban. Shadia is an international mediator that focuses on political transition of separatist liberation movements in regard to their identity, religion, and dignity. Additionally, Shadia is a journalist, translator, and activist, and advocates to increase the role of women in peace efforts and post-conflict management. She was a fellow at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and is currently a consultant for Mediators Beyond Borders International and is part of the United Nations Development Program Express. All right, and then we have Peter Light. Peter served as the founding chairman of the J.P. Morgan Bank in China, as well as the founding representative of Manufacturers Hanover Trust Company in Beijing. He has a PhD in East Asian Studies from Princeton University and has worked as a professor in Asian history and philosophy. Currently, Peter is on the board of a few educational nonprofits and is a mosaicist and calligrapher and is the author of 2 books that are sold here at Mackey, and the proceeds go to charity, so check those out. And then we have Neil Diamant. Neil is a professor of law and Asian society at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, but also teaches classes on Israeli politics and Zionism. Neil received his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and his research focuses on China's civil-military relations, the history of Chinese constitutionalism, patriotism from a comparative perspective, and law and society in Asia. And then finally, we have Robert Kaufman, who is the Doxson Professor at Public Policy at Pepperdine University, in which he specializes in U.S. foreign policy, national security, international relations, elections, and presidential politics. He received his PhD at Columbia University and is the author of 3 books and is the current adjunct scholar at the Heritage Foundation. All right, and now we can get started. I will pass it off to Robert to start with the opening remarks. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes or so, and then we will take questions at the end.
First, a slight correction and an advertisement. 4 books, including my most recent, Dangerous Doctrine, How Obama's Grand Strategy Weakened America, including in East Asia, which is the topic of this final panel, at least for me, unless God is going to punish me even further. I never like the title of these panels, and this is less objectionable than most, but the way I look at this panel is that not just trouble in the South China Sea, but trouble with an increasingly authoritarian, illiberal China seeking to dominate the most important geopolitical region of the 21st century. This increasingly assertive Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, everywhere, is a manifestation of that bid for hegemony that I and like-minded people believe is rooted in the authoritarian, illiberal nature of a Chinese regime that can be understood best in terms of its mindset by reading Chinese document number 9, which you can find, ironically enough, on the New York Times website, something that Xi Jinping sent to his Politburo indicating China's goals, in my view, and their adversarial relationship to freedom and an American presence in the Western Pacific. China has antagonized virtually all of its maritime neighbors in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, by asserting sovereignty and behaving that way based on a 9-dash line that nobody in international law respects. Why are the Chinese doing this? Partially, the Chinese understand that there are vast, or there may be, vast resources, including petroleum resources, that China needs to fuel its voracious desire and need for energy. This is one of the other reasons why China, besides asserting its sovereignty vigorously and vigilantly and belligerently in the South China Sea, has been building a blue water navy, including its first aircraft carrier. This is another reason why China has increased its military budget by double digits for over a decade and has developed and is developing a formidable anti-access capability that may prevent the United States from credibly projecting sea and air power in the waters of the Western Pacific. According to Chuck Hagel, one of Obama's most dovish of a parade of dovish secretaries of defense, Hagel conceded in 2015 that the waters of the Western Pacific are now militarily contestable for the first time since 1944. This bodes ill for the specifics of the South China Sea and for American interests in general. So what are we to do about the South China Sea? Again, it depends on your perspective of what China's current trajectory is and what drives it. I don't believe it's inevitable China's going to be number one. On the contrary, I'm struck more by Chinese long-term weakness. As Joseph Joffe, the Harvard and Stanford professor, eloquently pointed out in The Myth of American Decline, China's rise is going to level off for a number of reasons having to do with the second stage of development and peculiar features of China's political system, its authoritarian, rigid system that is not a free market system. It rates 6 on a scale of 7 in terms of political freedom and economic freedom, according to Freedom House and the Wall Street Journal Heritage Foundation indexes, respectively. The Chinese are going to face, in my view, and I follow Gordon Chang and others on this, a reckoning the way Russia, the Soviet Union, did during the 80s. Sooner or later, I think the Chinese are going to confront that you cannot continue and reconcile economic dynamism with the monopoly of the Communist Party. And I believe that the Chinese Communist Party will try to resolve that dilemma, not by reform, but by expansion, if it does not confront a robust, credible, American-led democratic alliance system, the way Ronald Reagan's military build-up and reassertion of American power in the 1980s gave the Soviet Union in the 80s no choice but to reform and take a gamble on Gorbachev rather than expand. What I fear is that we have been going the other way, particularly the past 8 years under Obama, where he put us on a course to have a Navy of 230 surface ships. That's a Navy smaller than what the United States had going into World War I. I won't give you the specifics of the other capabilities that the Chinese have been developing to deny us access to the Pacific. If you're interested, you can read my book. But the remedy for what ails us is to understand that the Chinese are a competitor/adversary rather than a partner for stability. The remedy for what ails us is to restore American military preeminence with a generous margin to spare in the waters of the Western Pacific, on land, at sea, in the air, and in outer space. What is the remedy for our current situation with China in the South China Sea and otherwise is to forge and continue on George W. Bush's historic initiative to engage a decent, democratic, pro-American India, which under this Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is pro-free market, wary of an authoritarian China's expansionism, with us on the danger of radical Islam because they have their own problem, and refreshingly, given the state of the world as it is, Modi is robustly pro-Israel as well. So the South China Sea, in my view, cannot be seen as isolation, but part of what analyst Robert Haddock calls a salami slicing strategy, which is aimed by slow accretions to transform the dynamics and balance of power in the waters of the Western Pacific to China's advantage. East Asia is the #1 region geopolitically and in terms of power potential for the 21st century. Just as we had a vital interest in the 20th century in stopping Germany from dominating Europe, as we did in World War I and World War II, just as we had a vital interest in stopping the Soviet Union from achieving the same, we have a vital interest in ensuring that China's rise does not end with China's dominance of the most important geopolitical region of the world for the 21st century. So we ought to draw our line in the sand in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. We have to mean what we say and say what we mean. We cannot repeat the failure of the last 8 years where we've had a president who believes that soaring rhetoric can substitute for American resolution and resolve. Thank you for your forbearance.
Thank you all for coming at this late hour. I know it's afternoon, and unless you've had a lot of coffee, it might be hard to stay awake. Frankly, I'm a little bit confounded by assertions that there's a connection between regime type and foreign expansion or aggressiveness. After all, it has been the United States that has been the most destabilizing factor in international politics in the last decade, certainly since the Middle East. I mean, we are still at a war in Afghanistan and Iraq. China, for its part, does not send its People's Liberation Army out to other countries and occupying it. So it's just not logical to make that conclusion. So what do I think the South China Sea is all about? Let me give you what is the dominant narrative, and I think you heard part of that dominant narrative right here in Robert's comments. I think this dominant narrative is promoted by non-China experts, DC policy think tanks, and by the media. And I think it sort of is based on a tripod. The first part of this tripod is that China's foreign behavior is shaped by its economic interests. That it needs energy, and it can get this energy in abundance underneath the South China Sea. So that's the first part. The second part is this element of so-called rising nationalism in China, that China feels that it is a rising power, and to assert its dominance, it needs to expand its territory, much like other rising powers have throughout history. So that's the second part. The third is the role of the current party secretary, Xi Jinping. He sees himself as a dominant leader, a first among equals, very much different than previous Chinese administrations where there was sort of a power balance between factions. And so he doesn't want that sort of coalition politics anymore. But I think there are reasons to doubt this dominant narrative. First of all, in terms of economic interests, there are easier ways to secure energy that are cheaper and less vulnerable. It is very expensive to build oil rigs in the South China Sea. These oil rigs would be susceptible to American naval power in the South China Sea. It is very hard to extract oil from that far down in the ocean. It is almost uneconomical to do that, particularly now when China is also pushing for green energy. It can bolster its investments in green energy. It can buy oil elsewhere in the world market. Secondly, why didn't this conflict over the South China Sea happen earlier? I mean, why now? Why after 2012 do we see this? Why not in 2007, 2008, 2009? The same circumstances existed, and yet South China Sea was barely on the radar. It wasn't this big international thing that the world was concerned about. There are also reasons to doubt this narrative of rising nationalism. The South China Sea has never been integral to the dominant narrative of Chinese nationalism, which has focused on regaining the territories of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. In fact, one sees in the history of the PRC's diplomatic relations flip-flopping back and forth on just who the South China Sea, those islands, belong to. China was not always adamant that it was these areas were theirs. In terms of nationalism, I think young people in China have other things to be concerned about, including difficulty finding employment for university students. Many want to go abroad, many want to make money, and the South China Sea for them is tangential to their everyday concerns. As for the role of Xi, the timing of this trouble in the South China Sea suggests that it's not a coincidence. He came to power in 2012, and it's pretty much after that time that one sees the rise of this international attention to this problem. But the question is, what does he really want? Does he want sovereignty? Does he want control? Or does he want something else? That is, what are his motives? And here, I'd like to offer an alternative read, and it's based on sort of the ABCs of political science. And the rule number one in political science is that politicians like power and want to keep power. In other words, the South China Sea story is primarily a domestic politics story, or more accurately, a story between the connection between domestic politics and international relations. Now, why do I say this? As Robert pointed out, the Communist Party has very serious problems at home. And these problems don't necessarily mean that we should anticipate the end of the Communist Party. The Communist Party is fairly flexible. It learns from its mistakes. It has numerous ways of adapting to various challenges. And that's why you see the Communist Party still in power in China, and you don't see the Communist Party in power in this former Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party has proved quite adaptable to various changes over the years. That said, its challenges are very, very serious. There's this index called the Gini Coefficient, which measures inequality, where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is perfect inequality. That means so if it's 0, one person owns everything, and if it's one person owns everything. So in 1985, China's Gini coefficient was 0.3. Now it is 0.55 to 0.6, which means China is a highly, highly unequal society, more unequal to ours. And the Chinese leadership knows that high levels of inequality is not a good thing. It can cause unrest, dissatisfaction with the regime, particularly if they're not able to solve that problem. China knows that its model of economic development is unsustainable. It knows that it can no longer export itself out of its economic problems. It can no longer be the factory of the world, polluting its way through economic growth. It realizes that it needs to change. However, it is not all that clear how exactly it will do this. So this is a big headache for the Chinese leadership. It has to feed over 1.3 billion people. We're not used to these sort of numbers, but if it was your responsibility to make sure that that number of people are governed, fed, you also would be up at night wondering how this is going to be done. China has rampant corruption. Everybody knows this. It's well known among the ordinary population and the leadership too. The Communist Party knows that it's the previous government, the nationalists, lost in part because of corruption. And it worries that the same fate will befell it if it does not get a handle on this. Moreover, the Communist Party knows that no one ever voted for it. It does not have electoral legitimacy. It is there because it won a war, plain and simple, right? It won a war. It was based in the north and conquered the south. It has always been very, very sensitive about its legitimacy. This is from 1949. It's not anything new. So its legitimacy is quite fragile. From a domestic politics, elite perspective, many are very uncomfortable with the increasingly assertive role of Xi Jinping in the top levels of leadership. He behaves quite autocratically. His political style is quasi-Maoist in his determination to create kind of crises, mobilize people in large campaigns, and many are uncomfortable with this. They see this as a return to the days of the Cultural Revolution. So he asserts dominance, but this doesn't mean that everybody is behind him lockstep. So how does all this affect the South China Sea? Here we have to ask, who benefits from not working to solve this problem? Right? In politics, we always have to ask, follow the money and who benefits, right? Whose interests are served? So is it possible that politicians benefit from creating a crisis and then stepping in to solve this crisis? And if we look at the history of the Communist Party from the 1940s on, we see a pattern of governing through crisis that it intentionally creates. And every crisis needs an enemy. In the 1950s, China's enemy was the United States. Later on, in the late 50s, 1960s, it was the Soviet Union. In the 2000s, it was mainly Japan. The Communist Party needs an antagonist. It needs some sort of opposition out there so it can say to its population, look, we're helping to protect you. We're helping to guard our sovereignty from forces outside of the country. So I think governing via crisis, intentionally created crisis, is part of the political DNA of the Chinese Communist Party. So what we see here in the South China Sea is actually nothing really new. It's part of a long-standing governance mode. And so what does this help explain? Well, who benefits from the crisis? First of all, when you generate a crisis, you have a rally around the flag effect. Right? You create a crisis, all of a sudden everybody's talking about, oh, what's the United States doing, right? They sent an aircraft carrier. What's the Philippines doing? What's Japan doing? All of a sudden people are all abuzz, right, about this. We see the same thing here in the United States. Moreover, once there is a crisis, Xi Jinping can assert more control. Right? It is a test of loyalty, and he can say to his compatriots, I need to deal with this. I need to be in charge. I need to make sure that this crisis is going to be handled well. And this is exactly what he's done. He's formed a leading small group that is more powerful than the foreign ministry, more power than the political bureau, that is responsible for resolving the crisis in the South China Sea. So creating the crisis has allowed him the opportunity to assert control vis-a-vis his own circle of elites. And lastly, the crisis causes a distraction. Right? It's news, it's on the media, it gives politicians, not only in China but around the world, right? They can say, look at us, we're working hard. We can have a news conference, and the media eats this up. Right, because you see aircraft carriers in the South China Sea, pictures of islands. It's this big media spectacle. And I think we take these media spectacles too seriously and too literally. And I think we need to kind of step back a bit, see what interests are at stake, see who's making money, see who's getting more legitimacy. And this is the way to look at this problem, is through the context of history. Domestic politics is the best prism, and not through sort of casual assertions between regime type and foreign policy. I think that's a null sort of causal relationship. Thank you.
I'd like to begin with a quote from Henry VIII, who said to his wives, "I shan't keep you long." I'd like to introduce an image for you to take away of the Communist Party. It was devised by a friend of mine who was a professor at Berkeley named Perry Link, and he said the Communist Party was like an anaconda in a chandelier. The snake might never move or rarely move, but you don't want to be near it, and the further below you are the chandelier, the better off you'll be. It's a really very powerful image, and I'd like you to consider it. As a fellow Chinese historian, I'd like to introduce you to the concept of Tianxia, which means everything below heaven. And the very name of China itself, Zhongguo, means the central kingdom, and Zhong, meaning center, placed China at the center of this world, with neighbors, the same neighbors it has now on its periphery. And it provided a model for cultural perfection that could be gained from the Chinese model. There's a current reassertion of the traditional worldview of the China, coupled with newfound muscle to resuscitate in history. One cannot help but wonder if President James Monroe pinched his doctrine from the Chinese. But I reckon that Beijing's intentions now in the real world are not very clear. I think the Russians are very clear. They annex lands that were theirs in history. They're recovering the Crimea. They want to recover the lost Soviet Union with the Baltic states, for an example. But it's really interesting to note that Russia is economically insignificant to the West, and I think they're very easy to figure out. China, though, on the other hand, is a crucial economic partner with America and many Western countries and many countries in the world, which I think gives out very mixed messages and mixed agendas. At Princeton, I was told when I arrived that everything after the Ming is journalism. That's a good one, by the way. Think about that one, too. And in fact, I reckon that the last great foray of the Chinese into the South China Sea was in the Ming. But that image of conquest or cultural superiority got embedded through history in the minds of the Chinese. And I'd like to ask how that informs the current situation. After 49, I think Mao was too busy killing people to worry about the South China Sea. I think Deng was too realistic. China was too weak to challenge its neighbors. But now, the Chinese story and its neighbors who are weak and divided provide a very different kind of scenario. Early in the 21st century, China tried it on by flexing its muscle with the Japanese, sent some boats around, and there was a very robust response by the Japanese, and the Chinese hightailed it out of there. With the Chinese pivot to Southeast Asia, they were also driven by, and this is in keeping with what Neil is talking about, the reality of a faltering economic growth scenario. I think a distraction served up by jingoistic narrative takes people's eye off the economic ball. Coupled with this is the unintended consequence of the American pivot to the Far East. America sadly turned down China's invitation to join the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. The TPP excluded China. So the reversal of the TPP, which leaves America out of Asia and leaves China as the preeminent regional power. In Southeast Asia, it's left now to deal with China. It's left on its own to deal with China. And China's economy is deprived of American regional involvement. The irony is that with China's rise in Southeast Asia, China's economy is currently disadvantaged. Southeast Asia now is left on their own with China, and America is out of the picture. I would just like to make one more comment. I think what matters most for America now is to remain aspirational. I want people to come to America. I want people to have American passports. I don't know of anybody who wants a Chinese passport or a Russian passport except Gerard Depardieu, and you can have them, and the like. So please, I am waving the flag for America in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I come from Indonesia, and that's part of Southeast Asia, and that's been one of the topic that most of us discussed. I want to start with what Rodrigo Duterte said. He's currently the president of the Philippines. He said, "Goodbye to the United States and hello to China." And this is his statement. He said, "My relation with China now is springtime." And sooner before that, he planted many Philippines flags in 9 of those 10 islands that he disputed, one of them in Titu Island, which is in Spratly. And let's not forget that Philippines has been an ally with the United States for many, many years. And Duterte, being a very populist elected, he get rid of drugs. He killed people dealing with drugs directly. He has a SWAT group that can kill drug dealers. And he is loved by the people because of the stability that he created in the Philippines. Although this only be temporarily, but I just want to give you the picture of how the relation of United States and the Philippines that affecting all of us also in Southeast Asia. In particular, other areas is the claim, China claimed almost the entire South China Sea because like what Peter said, that according to China, Middle Kingdom or whatever sort of China power in the past, South China Sea belonged to them. That's what Chinese government had in their mind. And the entire South China Sea costs about 5 trillion worth of trade passages each year. So we're not just talking about claim, we're talking about money. There are money, and a big, huge amount of money affecting countries such as Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam, that also have claim to parts of the sea. Jakarta, my government in Indonesia, traditionally has taken a neutral position, acting always as buffer between China and the ASEAN members. The ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Countries. And ASEAN operates based on non-interference. So that's funny if you look at in our area. So the motto of ASEAN is non-interference. So imagine, how are we going to deal with China? And how are we going to deal with those countries that are affected by Chinese policies and also probably some of the movement of the US Army towards the South China Sea? The role of Indonesia as diplomatic broker are in high demand. Many of the countries are asking Indonesia to deal, but Indonesia also have a little problem with China, which is the Natuna Island. The Natuna Island is the island consists of nothing but oil. No human being there. Oil. And that has created a big problem in terms of building trust and relation with China. However, as you know, the ASEAN non-interference method, we are also a country in Southeast Asia, mostly we don't talk very much, but we talk, you know. It's a kind of, we are more engaged in the talks, not during a formal time. but in the informal time. So most of these talks are happening during the informal time, like tea time, during the break session of the ASEAN meetings and so forth. But my point here is that the US government sending a very low-level rank to the ASEAN meeting to discuss about South China Sea. And let me tell you, the Chinese government sent the highest officials to deal with government. And because we are left alone, as Peter said, with China, more and more we turn over to China, not only because the dragon, the big dragon that we have to live with for the last 2,000 years. The second is also dependency on the economy and the development. Many of our airports in Southeast Asia are built by Chinese. All the bridges, all the schools, the water system, everything you name it, mostly, I would say, are built by the Chinese. And we've seen also the stretching all over to Africa. And the style of the Chinese government in delivering the aid are different than those countries in the West. And people in Southeast Asia felt this is a different way of getting ourselves into a modernization without having to beg for money in terms of development. So maybe you're correct about nobody wants to have a Chinese passport, a Russian passport, or everybody wants a US passport. But I do believe now people in Southeast Asia want their own passport, their own passport with dignity, where they can live at the same level as their Western partners. And this is very crucial because economically we are growing. We are the fastest growing region in the world. And China are not stupid. They are watching. They are watching closely. They are not just putting the right people into most of these countries. They are putting expertise. They are putting expertise, not only political, but they're putting expertise and quality machine that you can ever imagine built by in Indonesia. I can give you many examples. And Kishore Mahbubani, a Singaporean scholar, recently wrote an article at Straits Times. He said, China is belligerent or assertive. So maybe I would like to end with that thought. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, panelists. As the questions come in, I will open the floor up for any panelists to respond to each other. Additionally, if you are a student, please indicate that you are a student as you send your question in. And all right.
I have a response. Political scientists are not united at all on the relationship between regime-type ideology and external behavior. There's a long and venerable tradition going all the way back to K.D. Brocker, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel Huntington, and others. And I thought a Berkeley guy would know that because Ken Waltz laid out Image 2 and manned the state in war, and he was their IR guy for a long time. George Kennan's logic that the Soviet Union's aggression, the wellspring of it was the nature of its regime and ideology. Our successful policy after World War II, eradicating Nazism and replacing it with stable liberal democratic institutions, not only there in Japan, on the idea that those democratic regimes would be more benign to their people and their neighbors. This has a long and venerable tradition. It does in the Middle East as well. There are people like Dan Pipes and Bernard Lewis, as good as any, who argued the same thing. So there is not a political science speaking to this. I think you have to look at Chinese behavior, not just in isolation. What does their military behavior look like? What does their behavior in the South China Sea look like? What is their leadership telling their political cadres? Is China becoming more or less cooperative, more or less belligerent? Why is China the #1 party waging cyber warfare against us? Why is China building a blue water navy? Why is China increasing its anti-satellite capability to impair our command, control, communication, and intelligence? And more bluntly, why are all of China's neighbors so terrified, even Vietnam, our former enemy, that they are clamoring for us to do more? From Tokyo to South Korea to India to Vietnam, China's neighbors understand that this regime has swelling ambitions, and that as long as the Communist Party runs China and wants a monopoly of power, they will view the United States and the freedom we have and the power we possess as the chief obstacle to their ambitions. What we need to do is to deny China a plausible strategy to think that deterrence in East Asia isn't as robust as deterrence was in Europe to produce a favorable outcome in the Cold War. So I dissent, and whether you agree with me or not, it's just not right to say that quote-unquote political scientists do not draw a linkage between regime type and behavior. Maybe neorealists or strict realists don't, but many people do. I'm one of them, and I'm a political scientist. And overall, I think we have the better of the debate in general and on China in particular. And finally, as for the claim of quote-unquote non-regional specialists, regional specialists have a rotten record historically in predicting the behavior externally of the regions they're studying, because there's a tendency to get embassyitis. The greatest Sovietologists, Adam Ulam and Richard Pipes, were outliers. That goes for the greatest students of the Middle East, Bernard Lewis and Dan Pipes. And many of the Chinese experts who are not in the academy, aren't in the academy, like Michael Pillsbury, who knows as much about the Chinese military as anybody, because they violate the consensus. That doesn't mean the consensus is wrong or right, but there is no consensus about the lack of linkage between China's external behavior and its internal regime. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence to the contrary in general, and on China in particular.
Just two quick comments. I think it's quite correct to remember that China is surrounded by enemies all through history, but it would be a damn shame if we somehow are complicit in driving them into the arms of their enemy. I think we have to find a way to stay important in Southeast Asia, and also doing business with the Chinese. I think another thing, I think a lot of China's foreign policy is commodity driven. They are raping and pillaging Africa because they want stuff. I don't think they care if anybody's a commie there. I really don't, or any place else. I think the Chinese are dreadful at representing themselves culturally abroad. They have no feel for soft power. They have a tin ear for making their case. So I don't think that's the real problem. I think, especially in the world we're living in today, where, believe it or not, China is surrounded by enemies, with its only friend, God help them, North Korea. I mean, that's some honor. We have to find a way of pairing up with them, because I think the closer we get to China, the closer our economic relationship gets to China, the safer the world will be. And my concerns now are not with a Russian hegemony, but with a short, egotistical buffoon who's a nasty man in the Kremlin.
Okay, I just need to make two corrections. First of all, does everybody know why there was a Great Wall? Okay. Was there a Great Wall along the coast? Okay, so did China conceive of itself historically as a maritime power or a land-based power? Land. That's right. So throughout history, China's main concern was invasion from the north, not from the South China Sea. From the 15th century on, China did not have any navy of significance, and certainly did not assert control over the South China Sea, and certainly not because of some idea of cultural superiority. There's a lot of literature about China's relations with its inner Asian neighbors that asserts that China dealt with them, all rhetoric aside from Confucianism, as equals, completely as equals. That there was a sort of a balance of power arrangement in Asia throughout history. So the notion of cultural superiority was an ideal more than it was reality. So we cannot make sort of casual assertions between China's very long history and its current behavior. Second of all, you're right that there's no consensus, but that's my point, that there is no consensus that authoritarian regimes are more aggressive. And a lot of the literature you cited was 30 years old or more. I'd point everybody to a recent article by Azar Ghat in World Politics called Democratic Peace Revisited, where he looks whether or not democratic regimes are actually more peaceful than non-democratic regimes. And you can think of the logic of it. If a democratic leader is sort of dependent on public opinion to stay in power, why wouldn't they start a war to gin up the masses in order to support them? And this is what happened historically on many occasions. And I think that neoconservatives have yet to take full responsibility for the disasters in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it is very, very incumbent upon us to learn the mistakes of asserting American power willy-nilly in areas that we don't understand. And I think that
Let's hear from the students in the audience.
Disagree.
So what? Let's move on.
Okay, here's a question from a student. It may be true that China has significant issues at home, but is that itself a reason for surrounding concerned nations and the United States to disregard a clear military aggression and expansion in the South China Sea?
No.
I say no also.
Ditto. Next.
So let me elaborate a little bit. See, I was trying to explain. I did not say anything about how we should respond. And I completely agree with Robert that we need to call China on its game, and we need to set lines in the sea, as it were. We need to protect lanes of commerce. We need to back up our commitments with military force if necessary. I'm not asserting that China is necessarily a peaceful power, but we need to understand the domestic imperatives that is driving its behavior.
All right, the next question from a student. What will our relations with China resemble after conflict, if conflict was to occur? Would there be an embargo, or could it lead to something worse in the future?
Oh, this is...
That's a hard one to answer because it depends on the nature of the conflict, the circumstance, whether it's economic, political, or military. And I think, and I understand that the legitimate impulse for the question, but you'd think we need something more focused to give a response that is useful. I don't know how to respond to it in its current form.
I personally don't think that China is looking for war. I don't think so. I mean, we might face thousands of difficulties in dealing with China, in particular in the South China Sea, because it's affecting most of the countries in Southeast Asia. But war it's really not an option because there is money in it, number one. And number two, if you ask, I was just in Guangzhou before I came here. And if you talk to ordinary Chinese on the street, do they care about South China Sea? I don't think so. They probably think about what's the next new Prada handbag, Seriously.
The women.
Well, I talk to the women.
You're too uptight. It's a new world.
I was surprised because many of these people or students or just ordinary people whom I talk to, I mean, they don't have this, similar anxiety or whatever you want to call it with the same people in, like in the Philippines or in Vietnam. In particular, Vietnam is affecting harshly by the new policy by China. But I don't see war as an option.
I remember when the first time I visited Vietnam, I was feeling very awkward about being an American there. I just didn't know what to do and how to behave. And I remember I was in an antique shop and with my high school French, and it was just rubbish. But I tried to make myself understood, and I tried to be contrite and just respectful of the deal. Whether I was for or against the regime, it didn't matter in the war. I just wanted to behave myself. And he said, "Oh, don't worry. You're way down the line of the enemies. They were the French, and we've hated the Chinese forever."
Okay. This one's kind of opposite. Can America and China work together to control or limit, in this specific instance, the nuclear threat of North Korea?
I just came from a panel early in the morning dealing exclusively with the North Korean issue. I emphasized at that point that I don't think that China has all that much leverage over North Korea, because North Korea does what it does precisely to be provocative, to get more international attention, to get aid, to make itself important on the world stage. We don't know what goes on between the intelligence agencies of China or South Korea in the north. There's just a whole lot we don't know. But I think that both the United States and China have limited capability to control the behaviors of that guy, Kim Jong-un, just like China and North Korea don't have a lot of influence over the behavior of our president.
It also assumes that China has an interest in helping us on North Korea, and I think that's a debatable proposition. North Korea, as we've heard, is one of China's few friends, and China benefits from North Korea within boundaries of controlling risk. So, and whatever the Chinese want in exchange for their quote-unquote help on North Korea, which is probably some concession on Taiwan, it's not worth paying.
How do you call China out on its game when Chinese investors are investing so much in U.S. currency, bills, and bonds to undervalue its own currency?
China is not doing that. They're just not doing that. They're not weakening their currency. In fact, they're doing the opposite because, as I mentioned in an earlier panel, and nobody under 90 understood what I was talking about, because China just used to want to make Beanie Babies and sell them all over the world. And now the Chinese government wants the Chinese to consume. So the agenda is very different now. So,
best thing we can do is, in that regard, is convince businessmen to invest more in a more capitalist, pro-American India, which has the rule of law and has a Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, committed to free markets, deregulation, and when he was running Gujarat, Gujarat had growth rates in excess of China's. And this year, according to the International Monetary Fund, India's growth rate was number one, exceeding China's, which is slowing down. So if you're worried about a dependency on China for a variety of reasons, economic, military, and political, think India.
Okay. I need to push back against that.
Good.
Precisely because China is more capitalistic than India. India's economy has been quite socialist from its history under Nehru, very much under the influence of the Soviet model of development. It is much more difficult to be an entrepreneur in India. There's a reason India doesn't attract as much foreign investment as China. Entrepreneurs know what they're doing. Okay? They do not invest in India for a certain reason. And secondly, China outperforms India on every single measure of human, what's it called, the human index? What's it called? Human Development Index. If you look at female literacy, If you look at GDP per capita, if you look at poverty, every single measure that the UN has developed, China has outperformed India, even though India is a democracy.
Just one more comment about China investing in America, putting its money with us. I know that if somebody lends me some money, I'm pretty grateful. China is lending us lots of money, and we're pissed off. And I would also say that there could even be an element of racism about this sort of yellow peril, they're going to buy America and all this kind of stuff. I really don't get that. And I would suspect that no country in the world has a greater stake in the performance of the American economy than the Chinese. We're a good investment.
Well, I mean, I just want to give you a small example of the development that is being done by the Chinese government, in particular in countries such as like Myanmar. I happen to work there. I mean, if you don't come to Yangon in 6 months, and you come back after, you'll see something new is being done, whether it's bridge, whether it's new electrical installation, high-speed train, new airports. Where is all the money from China? They are everywhere. Some of the USAID money that goes to Southeast Asia are, even though they are invested in infrastructure, but many of them are invested also in other parts of, like trainings and skills. The Chinese don't care about trainings and skills. They just keep building. And people saw that result. Oh, new airport built by the Chinese. I mean, when you come from a place where it was nothing before, and then all of a sudden you have good airports, you have good roads, there's nothing you can say about it, and people happy. That's how I see people in Myanmar, in Cambodia, and elsewhere.
Okay, this is a more technical question, but what international law applies to the South China Sea?
Sorry?
What international law applies to the South China Sea?
Law of the sea, and also traditional, customary international law. And by any standard, I haven't seen an article outside of China. Otherwise, China's very controversial 9-dash line violates both international law and customary law of the sea. No one but China recognizes their claim as a matter of international law. Certainly not their neighbors or traditional understanding of legitimate claims to territorial seas.
Right. I mean, I agree with that. But there's an interesting issue with this 9-dash line, is that nobody really knows who did it. From what level of the government it comes from. Did it come from the military and was published by hawkish people there? There's a lot of kind of mystery of how this came to be Chinese policy. It seems to me that there's a lot we still don't know about how that happened. But he's right. There's nobody except for the Chinese government thinks that it's legitimate.
All right, this question's directed towards Robert Kaufman. Are you suggesting that the U.S. should implement preemptory military strikes against China as a deterrent to their growing presence in the South China Sea?
No, and my third book dealt with preemption in defense of the Bush Doctrine, which I still defend, because whatever you think, we had won the war in Iraq until we improvidently withdrew. Don't take my word for it. Take Joe Biden's on June 21st, 2009, when we decided to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. No, China is an entity that calculates risk in a very sober way, even though their ambitions are inimical to ours. And you can contain China with a robust deterrent underwritten by American military preponderance with Japan, South Korea, and a decent democratic India as the linchpins of an alliance system. So no, I'm not calling for preemptive war. Quite the contrary. Whether you agree with me or not, I'm arguing that my strategy is the best way to prevent war, so that when China reaches a critical decision, which I think it will, about whether you can maintain the monopoly of the Communist Party or expand, the Chinese will look across and see the equivalent of a Reaganite robust deterrent adapted to the conditions of the 21st century and say, it's better to reform rather than to roll the dice the way the Imperial Japanese and other regimes confronted with that choice have done. So you and I, or whoever the questioner is, share a common concern. We want to minimize the risk of war, miscalculation, and make sure that if somebody miscalculates on the other side, because even the best deterrents fail, we win that conflict at the lowest possible cost and risk because of the preponderance of American power, or what Winston Churchill felicitously calls an imbalance of power in favor of the forces of freedom.
How could any president have prevented the Chinese from building a large deep-water navy in the South China Sea?
They don't have a
They
deep-water
don't have
navy.
one.
They'll have one aircraft carrier.
And
which
it's
is-
an old Russian tub.
And they use it for propaganda for the most part. there's no deep-water navy.
And they have the right to defend their commerce.
It's called the Blue Water Navy, folks, for those of us who taught at the Naval War College, not a deep water navy.
He couldn't resist.
Okay. Okay, this one just came in. Could you speak to the specific advantages politically China gains from the lack of U.S. involvement in the Asia? I can't read that, sorry. Infrastructure Bank and vice versa. The TPP for the U.S.
Can you repeat that?
Sorry. What are basically what does China gain specifically politically from the lack of U.S. involvement in the Asian Infrastructure Bank?
Well, historically, China doesn't have allies. Even now, China doesn't have alliances the same way the United States has alliances. This is true historically, and it's true today also. But China is more than willing to invest in relationships that benefit its interests, and we see this through the multiple infrastructure developments. And so long as we are not pushing back, with our own infrastructure programs, it just lends a more favorable environment for Chinese investors. It builds up support for China in the United Nations and domestic opinion in all these countries that it invests in, as you pointed out. But this is kind of their neighborhood, right? Why should we expect China to behave any differently, unless the American taxpayer, right, is willing to ante up and say, for every dollar that China spends, we're willing to spend too, right? And I don't think that's going to happen. So if we really care, we have to put our money where our mouth is, and if we don't, we should just shut up.
And if the State Department's budget has been cut so dramatically, I fear for that. And that only makes China's life a lot easier.
I think for some of the countries in Southeast Asia sees this new administration also kind of confused, I would say, in terms of addressing not only development issues, but seriously about the situation of the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. I mean, if you're sending a low-level people to this stuff, meeting, and so the most of the government of, in Southeast Asia certainly will look to China because they felt that these countries give more respect to them, and I hate to say this, but that's the reality. Recently there was a meeting in Laos, and the civil society organized a people-to-people discussion, and that discussion was very much talking about how can we, live together, knowing all this situation with the Philippines and Vietnam. And I was really impressed, by some of these young Chinese, students who are really putting out their ideas. I mean, they're not as harsh as we thought, and some of them are very wise. And these are just a group of young students. So I think we must also acknowledge there's some changes in the way the Communist Party meritocracy system in addressing political issue. And I think some of these countries in Southeast Asia start to realize that. So more and more, because of confused, Trump administration, then they turn to China.
Okay, this is a question from a student. It's a little long. What role, if any, do China's historical losses to foreign naval powers have in relation to their policies in the South China Sea today? With Japan, Russia, South Korea, North Korea, and China all having links to the East China Sea, could the Chinese naval assertions be seen in the South also take place in the East China Sea as well?
It is taking place in the East China Sea. The Chinese have provoked a controversy with Japan, the United States, asserting a no-fly zone. The Chinese provoked an incident with the USS Kaufman, ramming it in international waters. This is why I say that I don't look at this in isolation, but whether China's assertive behavior in the South China Sea is an anomaly, and then you can say there's a specific set of regional concerns, or does it seem to fall in a pattern of their general behavior of assertiveness throughout the waters of the Pacific, including the East China Sea, and does it fall into a more general pattern of a more assertive China in terms of building up an array of military capabilities designed to undermine the capacity of the United States to project force to East Asia, the essential variable without which we don't have a credible alliance system to deter? And I see the more ominous pattern having more credibility than the more benign assessment, although the evidence is not definitive in terms of a summary judgment, to use a legal metaphor. But I think the Hawks have a good case circumstantially to be worried, and I am.
I think the Chinese government wants to make the assertion of a connection between the lost territories and the current situation in the South China Sea, tie it into this larger nationalist narrative of gaining back things that we had and were lost during our period of weakness. But I think it's very strained. And I think they know it's strained, and I think the Chinese public knows it's strained also. And this is not unusual. The government has multiple propaganda campaigns about lots of different things, and the population is often very skeptical. So yes, they do have this rhetoric, and yes, they do make these claims, but it doesn't mean that everybody buys into them or that it serves as the basis of their behavior. Sometimes they just rationalize things in this way, and it's not the actual wellspring of their behavior.
Just to give an oblique cultural example of this discussion, it's very interesting. I don't know if you've noticed, in the last few years there have been auctions of animal heads that came from the Summer Palace in China that the Chinese have been berserk about recovering. They're bronze, and Ai Weiwei made 2 sets of them, which are enormous. And if somebody, I think Yves Saint Laurent wanted to sell one, and the Chinese boycotted them and all this kind of stuff. What's so comical about this situation is they were from the Ming originally, Ming Qing period originally, but they were designed by Jesuits and fabricated by Italians. So the Chinese are killing themselves to recover Italian sculptures. And this is not that different from some of these territorial myths that are projected into the world.
This question is from a student. what would be the effect of the United States building artificial islands to match China's developments in the South China Sea?
Can we do that? don't we have to rebuild LaGuardia Airport first?
I think the first time I went to Hong Kong, there was a lot of space between the Star Ferry on the Victoria Island side and the other side on Kowloon. Now you can pole vault across because of the real estate development. So maybe some lessons have been learned for that. And I don't think we're going to get into that game.
Yeah, we don't do islands.
We don't do islands.
We don't do islands.
All right, we're just about 10 minutes in, so we'll take some more questions. To sum it up, what should be America's relationship with China, militarily, economically, and socially in the South China Sea? That'll take up 10 minutes.
I reiterate what I said before. The United States needs some variation of a containment strategy underwritten by credible military power and a democratic alliance system with the United States as the linchpin of it, and we should try to diversify our investments, trade with China, but try to constrain our trade in areas where there are dual uses, and also we have to be much more assertive in China rampantly violating our property rights, rampantly violating our patents. We have to defend our intellectual property rights with vigor, and we haven't been doing that for a long time. And the Chinese have a parasitical economy that depends less on their innovation and more on their stealing what we do. And the American Constitution is the first and only Constitution that understands and has protected in Article 1 of the Constitution patents and intellectual property as an essential component of freedom. We have to be much more assertive, not only defending our maritime rights, but our property rights, because the founders understood that property and freedom are inextricably linked. If you take one away, you're going to lose the other.
And I do agree that we need to call China out when its behavior is clearly in violation of international norms and international law. But I think that we need to remain very open and cosmopolitan in our perspective towards China, recognizing that the fundamental interests of most Chinese as a better life, more prosperity, political moderation are very much in line with our own. Most people there are not fundamentally ideological, fundamentalists in any particular way, and that the more we encourage Chinese students to come here, the more people we train here in the United States in Chinese, the more we encourage people to sign up to programs like Fulbright and other ones who come back here to the United States and can use their expertise in some way. I think the better for both countries. I mean, we are so connected with China these days. The relationship is very deep and very complex. And defense issues, I think, are a relatively small portion of it. When you kind of dig down and see so much commerce and trade and art exhibits and dancers and just China's all over now. And I think overall this enriches American society more than threatens American society.
I think it's worth mentioning that no people probably in the history of the world have suffered more at their own hand than the Chinese since 1949. I'm not going to go into the number game, but they are appalling, and they leave Stalin in the dust. Thus, I would say that no people are more allergic to instability in the world than the Chinese. And I think if we can play into that narrative by helping them maintain their brand of stability, and I am not in favor of stealing intellectual property, and I am not in favor of the destruction of democracy, but I would suspect that the greater the entanglements the United States has and enjoys now and into the future, the more likely that the Chinese themselves and their own society will improve and our world will become safer.
First, from the Asia side, it's to believe that we value the American democracy, but at the same time, we believe that there is also another power, is China. And I think to keep maintaining this imperial overstretching, it's not going to help us going anywhere. I think the shared power between China and the United States has to be maintained or even improved to in a better way, because I personally don't think that China wants to go to war over South China Sea, but it creates that image because the erosion of trust, and there is no direct dialogue and discussion over these issues, and unfortunately that ASEAN can help the United States very much, because many of these countries are afraid of China because of the economic dependency, and also because of what we are producing from our country are mostly sold to China. So you have to understand this fear from our side, that we are facing a giant dragon and also the United States power. So it's sort of squeezed in the middle. But however, we want to see a better future for both. Thank you.
All right, we have 4 minutes left, so I think it would be best to end on one last question. This one's from a student. To what extent could we expect our Asian allies, specifically Korea and Japan, to step up and take control of a regional situation without U.S. help?
They can't balance without the United States. Neither India nor Japan has the wherewithal to balance China with South Korea. No combination of powers can balance China without the United States. So there's no plausible, credible alliance system. Having said that, if you read the Japanese security statement of 2015, unlike our European allies, the Japanese are more than willing, and the United States should be thrilled with every new weapon system that the Japanese develop. The Japanese already spend a considerable amount on defense, and one of the remedies for China's bid for control of the Western Pacific is to allow the Japanese to build blue water navy. So the good news is we have willing Asian partners, but they can't do it alone. There's no plausible balancing strategy of Chinese power without the active participation of the United States. We can run, but we can't hide.
I'm in complete agreement with that. But let's not get caught up in this narrative of American decline, particularly in the Pacific. We are the dominant power there, have been throughout the second part of the 20th century. We are leaps and bounds behind China in terms of all weapon systems there, and it will be a very, very long time before China is able to meet us on any sort of equal playing field. For those who want more numbers about this, I point you to, I did this in an earlier panel, towards a book by David Shambaugh called China Goes Global, The Partial Power. And he very much contests this idea that China is close to us or getting close to us in terms of its maritime power. We're still the power there, and will be for a long time.
One more? Sure, come on. What are we here for?
We have 1 minute left.
Talk fast.
So let's fit this one in. Who in the Trump administration understands China?
James Mattis. Read James Mattis's very long talk to the CSIS in Washington, D.C., April 22nd, 2016. He is the soundest member of the Trump administration, and I would also take equal pleasure with the great Nikki Haley, who is our ambassador to the United Nations and will, I hope, someday be President of the United States.
All right.
I'm thinking maybe Ivanka. She knows how to sell stuff.
All right,
Marketing.
thank you to our panelists. Let's have a nice round of applause. What? Okay. And for everybody, this is Betsy. This is Betsy. This is Betsy.